is a bold, bold accusation. And so far, we've seen no actual evidence of any lies or any support for Joe Biden being involved in anything having to do with Ukraine other than promoting U.S. foreign policy. And I hope that you are not abusing the power as chairman of this committee, and that you are not wasting taxpayer dollars on a fishing expedition into a civilian child of a president for political purposes. I yield back.
The gentleman yield to a quick question. You don't have to. It's your choice. You yield.
Yeah, please.
So,
I would love to discuss this.
are you admitting that Joe Biden did get the prosecutor in Ukraine fired?
I think it's very clear that Vice President Biden, along with all of our allies in Europe, pressured Ukraine to fire a corrupt prosecutor general who was not charging corruption cases that would have included potentially Burisma.
Corruption with his son's company?
Yes. In fact, if what he wanted was the prosecutor general to prosecute corruption, and the allegations that you are making and that the Russians are making, because this is all part of Russian propaganda, is that Burisma was corrupt and Joe Biden was trying to stop an investigation into Burisma. That is categorically false, and there is no evidence of it.
Mr. Chairman,
we're going to recognize one more speaker. We've been requested by the presenters for a brief bathroom break. If you'll allow us, we have one more questioner, and then we'll take that break. Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute break. Mr. Timmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a big picture problem right now, and we're talking about Twitter specifically and Hunter Biden's laptop, but it's not just that. It's the general trend of the media, social media, the FBI, DOJ, doing one side's bidding. That's the issue. There's mistakes that have been made, and we keep looking back at these mistakes and say, oh, that shouldn't have happened that way. We are going to have a new policy to avoid that from happening again. But every mistake benefits one side. Every mistake benefits one side. Let's go back to 2016. The Democrat National Committee and the Clinton campaign paid Fusion GPS to fabricate the Steele dossier, which was the basis of this entire Russia collusion investigation. Special counsel, we spent $40 million pursuing it. There was no evidence of the Trump campaign colluding with Russia. There was none. It was actually fabricated by the Democrats and the Clinton campaign to create a narrative to damage President Trump. So that was a mistake. We all know that now. That was the conclusion of that investigation. And as a side note, that's why Adam Schiff is no longer on Intel, because he lied about that investigation. He said, as the chair of Intel, I have all this information. He abused his position, and that's why he was removed from Intel. So next, we go to 2020. Another mistake. We have something that is real labeled as something that is fake. We tell the American people that we're going to have an honest, open conversation about issues, about challenges that our country faces, and everybody has their own facts. Congressman from New York is mentioning his facts. It's just very bizarre that Hunter Biden making tens of thousands of dollars a month with no credentials from a business in Ukraine, whether they're being investigated, who knows? I mean, these are all speculation, and it's something the American people can't really digest because we don't know the answers to it. And when we're told the answers by our government, by big corporations, by big tech, and they're repeatedly wrong, it creates a trust issue. It creates a trust issue. So the American people do not trust what they're being told. They do not trust what they're being told. We're going to dig into the Hunter Biden laptop briefly. Jack Dorsey has said that he did not make that decision. Ms. Gaddy, did you make the decision to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story?
Yes, I was involved in that decision.
Who was the final arbiter? Because Mr. Roth has said he disagreed with that decision. Who was the final person that said, we're going to do this?
I ultimately approved that decision.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Roth, you have said previously that you did not believe that the New York Post story violated any policy. You've said that multiple times today. How many times, other than this one, did something get banned or flagged that you disagreed with? Is this the only one?
No, sir, not at all.
Okay, so
These are
Twitter
challenging.
Twitter repeatedly banned and censored material that you thought shouldn't be censored. Is that fair?
These are challenging judgment calls, and I think reasonable minds can differ about whether a given piece of
Okay,
content.
but on this
does
one you
or
did
doesn't.
disagree. I just want to say the American people need to have valid information to process decisions. I would argue that denying the American people the substance of Hunter Biden's laptop story was Hunter Biden's laptop was wrong. You got photos and text messages of Hunter Biden committing multiple felonies, which was never actually criminal. There were no criminal charges. Must be nice. Hunter Biden and James Biden were negotiating deals with Chinese Communist Party agents, one of whom Hunter Biden classified as the spy chief of China. We have evidence at least one of Hunter's deals with Chinese Communist Party linked entities. Joe Biden was given a 10% equity stake in the joint venture. You have evidence that the Bidens were trying to sell America's natural resources to the Chinese, and this is my personal favorite. Evidence that the Bidens and a Chinese energy company owned by the Chinese Communist Party had leased office space no further than 3 miles from where we're sitting right now. And the man running for president had his own office in that office space, his own personal office. You think the American people deserve to know that? I do. I think that there's a lot of smoke surrounding the Biden's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. There's a lot of smoke surrounding the Biden's relationship with Ukraine. And they deserve to have the facts to make a decision for themselves. Y'all got it wrong in 2016 with Russian collusion. You got it wrong with Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020. You got it wrong regarding COVID at every turn. The American people deserve better.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Then Mr. Raskins.
Mr. Baker, did you talk to any of the 51 former Intel officials who sent the now famous letter on October 19th, 2020, saying that the story in the New York Post had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation? Have you talked to any of those 51 prior to that letter being sent on the 19th or after?
Sir, I can't remember who's on that group, but
Clapper, Brennan, Morrill.
I've talked to those people during the course of my career, yes.
Have you talked to them in your time at Twitter?
I can't remember who's on that list, so I'm
No,
afraid.
how about the three I just mentioned, Clapper and Brennan?
Okay. All right.
Who I just mentioned?
Mr. Chairman, regular order.
Last
Regular.
question, but feel free to answer. Then we'll recognize Mr. Raskins.
Well, I was going to ask the gentleman before he left whether he's denying the Russian disinformation propaganda campaign that we've heard about from witnesses, or he's just denying Russian collusion, which was something that Mr. Mueller specifically did not address in his final report. He said collusion is not a legal concept. He was looking just at conspiracy, and he said there wasn't substantial enough evidence to charge conspiracy, but there were dozens of contacts between Donald Trump and the Russians that were documented in that report. That's all I wanted to say.
Mr. Chairman, if I could-
Chair recognizes Mr. Jordan, then we'll recess for.
Just to restate the question that's on the table to Mr. Baker. Did he talk with Mr. Clapper, Mr. Brennan, or anyone else that he knows of on that who signed that?
Point of order,
letter?
Mr. Chairman. Whose time is this now?
This
going
was
on?
The chairman's time.
remaining 3 seconds of.
He doesn't have remaining time.
Okay.
He's gone over by a minute.
We're over.
Mr. Baker, feel free to answer the question if you want, and then we'll take a recess.
Mr. Jordan, I don't recall discussing that publication that they did about the Hunter Biden laptop with any of those people.
We'll stand in recess for 5 minutes. When we return, Mr. Garcia will begin our questioning. We're in recess for 5 to 10 minutes. Now we'll resume questioning, and Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, and I just want to start off also by just apologizing to our witnesses, in particular Mr. Roth, for just the homophobic rant and comments that were recently just made from the gentle lady from Georgia. That was really shameful. And I know that we're here to talk about serious issues, and we're having conversations about Grindr and other issues, which is not really what this hearing is about. So apologize to all of our witnesses. Want to note that I am someone that you would probably call a Twitter super user. I use the social platform constantly. I communicate regularly. It's how I get my news. It's how I find out what's happening in popular culture. And I admire what Jack Dorsey, Evan Williams, and Christopher Stone actually tried to build as a company. I wish I could say the same for what the platform is today. I think to me and to many other users, we've seen the site currently degraded. We've seen Mr. Musk more interested in attacking journalists and uplifting conspiracy theories and actually running a company. And I think we can all agree that just overall the service has substantially degraded. I think just an example is the forced For You page mess that I personally don't like, and I think most folks don't as well. But I want to know more seriously that Mr. Musk and the current team has also done damage as far as trust and safety on the platform. He's gutted the trust and safety teams that have been described. He's eliminated content management systems and the human rights team, which, as we know, has ceased to operate. I do want to just take a minute to thank Mr. Roth and particularly Ms. Navaroli and your teams. I know that you are trying your best. I want to thank all of the folks that worked at Twitter because they believed in its mission. A mission I'm not sure holds true today completely, but it's one that I know a lot of folks worked on. And so just thank you for that work. And mistakes were made, and clearly you have actually lived up to those mistakes and the issues that have existed. But I especially want to thank you for your work around the pandemic. The pandemic took over 1 million American lives, 1,300 in my own city back home. And your decisions in content moderation actually saved countless lives in this country, including the work you did by moderating or banning members even of this committee who peddled in lies and were actively causing death and harm to others. And so for that work on content moderation, I want to thank you. And I want to go back to something that Mr. Roth said briefly. You had mentioned earlier in this hearing that you thought that currently there is still systemic election interference and interference happening. How serious do you think the current threat from Russia and other countries is to current election interference?
I think we can look to the evidence from the midterms to know that these campaigns are ongoing and they are serious. And it's not just Russia, Iran, and China, though they are the big players. There's now a playbook for how election interference works. And it's unfortunately all too cheap and all too easy for countries to try to carry this out.
Thank you. And I think it's pretty clear what we've learned today. One thing we've learned, which hasn't been much, by the way, is that there's current election interference happening today by Russia and other actors. And so that is something that's serious. That's what the focus of this hearing should actually be about, versus all of this kind of nonsense and lies and conspiracy theories that this committee is actually focused on today. I want to take the remaining balance of my time and yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
I thank the gentleman from California. I'd like to raise and follow up on a point that the opposition and the other side of the aisle is making, which is trying to insinuate that there is something scandalous or unusual about federal agency outreach to social media platforms and other organizations such as Twitter. The insinuation here is that in the FBI and other agencies reaching out to Twitter, that there's something nefarious about this, that this was some sort of partisan weaponization or attempt to intimidate. But we actually have quite a documented history of representatives from the Trump administration hailing the progress that the government had made in working with companies like Twitter to counter foreign influence operations and other areas of concern. In early March 2020, right before the Super Tuesday primary election, several Trump administration officials, including Mike Pompeo, Bill Barr, Chad Wolf, and acting director of national intelligence Richard Grenell issued a statement praising the government's cooperation with the private sector to fend off foreign interference and said that relationship was, quote, stronger than it's ever been. This was around this whole time where there's this grievance around this. And listen to what DHS Secretary Chad Wolf had to say just weeks before the 2020 presidential election. We now have direct lines of communication with tech and social media companies and election officials so that both parties can seamlessly take action against false information spreading online. I would argue that this information from the Trump administration would say that they would support your decision in temporarily suspending this disinformation that seemed to be coming out from the New York Post. So with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gaddy, Charlie Kirk and Dan Bongino are conservative commentators. Is that a fair characteristic? Just yes or no would be fine.
I believe so, but I'm not familiar with them.
Okay. The posters behind me show the side of Twitter that is not available to users. Is that correct?
This appears to be a view of some of our agent tooling, but I do not have access to that, so I'm not very familiar with that.
Okay, well, Ms. Gaddy, the labels identify status that have been assigned to these accounts. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Ma'am, these are your internal things. You're telling me you don't receive these, you don't know what they mean?
Representative, I did not have access to these tools, and so I don't know. They look familiar to me.
As an executive, you did not have access to inside information at Twitter. Okay. Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Bongino's account, there's a few words under the verified and active. Can you read the first two labels under verified and active? They're the yellow ones.
Notification spikes, search blacklist.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Bongino, ma'am, Mr. Bongino has more than 3.5 million Twitter followers. Is that correct, would you say?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, well, that is correct. Let's look at Mr. Kirk's account. Ms. Gaddy, can I get you to read the yellow labels on Mr. Kirk's account? Can you see those?
I'm sorry, I can't see them from right here.
All right. Do you know that Mr. Kirk has almost 2 million followers?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. Let me ask you, what is a search blacklist?
I do not know specifically what that is, but I could make a guess if that would be helpful.
Why don't you make a guess for me, please?
We do, when I was at Twitter, there was an ability to prevent something from appearing in one of the tabs of search results.
Okay, thank you. What does do not amplify mean?
To the best of my recollection, when I was at Twitter, it would mean that we would not recommend or amplify that content in the parts of Twitter where Twitter was making recommendations.
Thank you, ma'am. In 2018, you said that Twitter does not shadow ban. Twitter did, however, engage in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
I said Twitter, okay, they engaged in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I agree that visibility filtering does give an ability to change.
Okay. Shadow banning, ma'am, is understood that the practice is limiting the visibility of a user's post without their knowledge. How is visibility filtering any different?
Representative, I believe there are different definitions of shadow banning.
Okay. But you said that Twitter in 2018 does not shadow ban. Was that a truthful statement, ma'am? Was that a lie?
At that time, I had specifically defined shadow banning to mean something different than visibility filtering.
You also said that Twitter does not shadow ban based on political viewpoints or ideology. Do you stand by those comments?
While I was at Twitter, to the best of my knowledge, we did not do that.
Okay. Mr. Roth, on January 22nd, 2017, you tweeted that there were actual Nazis living in the White House. Do you still stand by that comment? Yes or no?
Sir, I regret the language I used. No, I do not.
Okay. Mr. Roth, earlier in your testimony, you said you regretted tweeting that, quote, actual Nazis are living in the White House. However, Iran's Ayatollah sent anti-Semitic tweets, one stating, quote, Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor that has to be removed and eradicated. Yes or no, did Twitter ever ban the Ayatollah or remove this hateful anti-Semitic tweet? Yes or no?
To the best of my knowledge, Twitter did not remove that tweet.
The answer is no. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that conservative voices are being silenced on social media in the mainstream. I appreciate this hearing. I might also suggest we look into holding one on DirecTV, Newsmax, and OAN. I give the rest of my time to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his good questions. So the user knows when their account's been suspended or blocked, but they don't know when they have some of these gold terms that were under Mr. Bongino and Mr. Kirk. Is that right, Mr. Roth?
As of the time that I worked at Twitter, yes, that's correct.
So they don't know if they're on the search blacklist. They don't know if they're on the do not amplify. They don't know that.
That's correct. Twitter did not disclose that.
So you did that to these two accounts. What I want to know did you know, Mr. Roth, if that was at the prompting of anyone from the government?
Gentleman's time's expired, but please answer the question.
No, sir, I'm not aware of any requests or orders or demands or anything from the government requesting that visibility filtering be applied to those accounts or any others.
Chair recognizes Mr. Frost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I mean, I've been sitting here for over 2 hours, and I'm still not really seeing the point of this hearing. Is it to solve the problems of the American people, what people are struggling with? No. We get it. My Republican colleagues wish that the Hunter Biden story would have helped them win the 2020 election, and that didn't happen. And so they're angry about it, and that's the point of this hearing. You know, it was actually the foundation of the chairman's opening statement. It's why he brought up that poll on the 2020 election. That's what this is all about. And so I want to say to my colleagues, don't worry. There's still many platforms you can spread disinformation on, Parler, Truth Social, that have questionable editorial policies but aren't here today. There was no collusion, as the witnesses have said, under oath. There was no pressuring from the United States government, as we heard under oath. We're wasting our time here bullying former Twitter employees. So that way, it's calling the ref. So that way, in the future, when they want disinformation to be put on the internet, social platforms will be scared to call them out down the road. It's called calling the ref. But let's talk about the root of this hearing. My Republican colleagues would have folks believe that Democrats are preparing for some sort of major culture war. And there's a difference between a culture war and how culture naturally changes, culture change. Some on this committee are very resistant to culture change. I mean, just yesterday we heard a member equate immigration negatively to changing our culture, black and brown folks coming to our country. The reality is that culture changes, it adopts, it welcomes more people, it becomes more understanding, and it also decides to reassess what's acceptable behavior and rhetoric. It could be different now than it was in, say, the 1950s. In this supposed culture war, they often conflate the right to free speech with the non-existent right to not be criticized or held accountable for what you say on the internet or even in real life. And just because it's legal to say something and the government won't throw you in jail for it, doesn't mean the rest of the world, and sometimes even your own family, have to associate themselves with you or your comments. Mr. Roth, you helped set up content moderation policy at Twitter. What type of user tweets were more likely to get limited? Did it have to do with racism, sexism, homophobia, violence, or were y'all looking for people who were supporting Donald Trump, President Trump, and limiting those?
Our policies were built fundamentally to be viewpoint neutral. They were focused on harm reduction, looking to things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with a focus on protecting people's safety, people's right to free and fair elections, people's rights to free speech. And we built concern with those rights into our policy.
So being a decent human being.
That's certainly what we tried to do.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Ms. Naravoli, earlier you testified about a 2019 tweet that was about President Trump. And I think it's from Ms. Teagan. What was the tweet about?
Would you like me to give the direct quote?
Yeah.
Please excuse my language. This is a direct quote, but Chrissy Teigen referred to Donald Trump as a pussy-ass bitch.
Okay. Free speech. And what happened after Ms. Teagan posted her tweet? What did the White House do? What did the Trump White House do?
From my understanding, the White House reached out to ask that this tweet be removed. It was my team's job. This fell underneath the policy for abusive behaviors, and we evaluated underneath our insults policy. At that time, up to 3 insults were allowed, and so it was our job to determine how many insults were included within that phrase.
So the Trump White House reached out, not an agency, but the White House reached out and requested that you remove the tweet?
From my understanding, yes.
Okay. Mr. Roth, you mentioned a serious problem of foreign interference in our elections. Did you see that mass interference work more in support of right-wing candidates like President Trump in 2016 or President Biden in 2020?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I don't think there's a clear or easy answer to this. We saw Russian operatives playing both sides and often playing them against each other. One of the most enraging interactions that my team saw were accounts operated out of the same Russian troll farm arguing with each other. And they were manufacturing drama both on Democratic sides and on the Republican
So it's still a huge issue.
Absolutely.
100%. Well, there you have it. There's issues of big tech. There are serious issues we need to litigate. Hunter Biden's laptop is not one of them. And like many of my colleagues have said, we need to talk about these issues, how January 6th maybe could have been prevented if Twitter had taken action due to the hateful speech, and how we have foreign interference in our elections. Why are folks on this committee so obsessed with Twitter's editorial decision on Hunter Biden's laptop? Would they hold the same hearings of the editorial decisions of Fox News and Newsmax? Free speech is about the government limiting speech around about the public. My governor, Ron DeSantis, is doing that right now. I have a venue in my district that he's revoking the liquor license of, trying to close because they had a drag show. We have teachers who are not able to teach the curriculum that they want because they disagree with Ron DeSantis and his view of the world. That is limiting free speech. And I'd love to see this committee bring in some of these governors who are abusing their power, like Governor DeSantis in my state of Florida, to limit the free speech of people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. And thank you for our witnesses for appearing as well. I want to be clear. Despite claims in witness testimonies, government cannot deputize the private sector for actions that would be otherwise be restricted by the Constitution. In this case, the censorship of lawful speech. Now I want to direct you to a tweet over my shoulder sent by President Trump on October 5th, 2020, before Twitter banned him from the platform. This was after President Trump had become infected with COVID and received treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center. It says in part, "Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life," end of quote. Do you see that, Mr. Roth?
Yes, sir, I do.
Less than an hour later, you received an email from James Baker at Twitter, reproduced behind me as well, saying, quote, "Why isn't this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID-19 policy, especially the don't be afraid COVID statement," end of quote. Isn't that correct, Mr. Roth?
Yes, I believe that's the email displayed.
Now, Mr. Baker, was it your understanding that the Twitter COVID-19 policy was people should be afraid of COVID?
Sir, my recollection.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat the question, sir?
Was it your understanding that Twitter's COVID-19 policy was, quote, people should be afraid of COVID? Yeah.
At that point in time, I did not fully understand what Twitter's COVID misinformation policy was, and so I was trying to understand.
I'm recapturing my time. So maybe you thought that Twitter's policy was that it should dominate people's lives. Is that what you thought?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you, sir.
So is it the fact that Twitter, don't let it dominate people's lives? Is that the problem with the tweet?
I didn't, at that point in time, I did not understand fully. I was relatively new at Twitter, and I was trying to understand what the policy was, and therefore I was.
I'm just going to ask you, the other two were asked, where did you go to medical school?
I beg your pardon?
Where did you go to medical school?
I did not go to medical school.
Good. Now, I'd like to have a yes or no from each of the witnesses on these following questions. Did you or others at Twitter communicate with government officials by means of disappearing messaging systems like Signal, Snapchat, or Wicker? Mr. Baker, yes or no?
Have I ever communicated with a government official using those?
Yes or no?
I don't recall.
Ms. Gaddy?
Not to the best of my recollection.
Mr. Roth?
Yes.
Mr. Rowley?
Not to my recollection, no.
Once again, did you or others at Twitter receive requests from federal law enforcement to allow criminal activity or content whose distribution is criminal to proceed on Twitter? Mr. Baker?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question, sir.
Ms. Gaddy?
Can you please repeat the question, sir?
Mr. Roth?
If I understood the question correctly, it was whether we received requests to allow unlawful activity, and
Yes.
the answer is no.
Okay, Ms. Navaroli?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Now, I'd like to submit for the record an article by the New York Post titled, quote, "Twitter refused to remove child porn because it didn't violate policies." Ms. Gaddy, who was involved in this determination?
I'm not familiar with this situation.
Mr. Roth, are you familiar with it?
No, sir, I'm not.
Once again, I'd like a yes or no from each of the witnesses. Did you apply labels to users with an administrative tool to downrank them? Mr. Baker?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm having a very hard time hearing your questions.
Ms. Gaddy?
I'm having the same problem, sir. Can you please repeat the question?
Mr. Roth?
I'm not sure I understood the question, sir.
Well, I'm asking you, did anybody use an administrative tool to downrank users?
Yes, sir. That's a part of Twitter's content moderation capabilities.
Mr. Baker?
Well, I'll rely on Mr. Roth.
Okay, Ms. Gaddy?
Yes, we're very public about our recommendation system
Thank
and how
you.
they work.
Mr. Chairman, today's witnesses played a central, powerful, and disturbing role in limiting not only free speech, but even people's good faith inquiries and research regarding their own health. The Internet is increasingly where my constituents go to engage in civic discourse. Our liberties as Americans will be diminished if we do not recognize our speech is increasingly virtual and right now subject to hostility and threatened through bans and deplatforming. The suggestions by witnesses that all of the removal of, quote, lawful but awful speech, quote, was done in favor of users is bunk. You could just as easily provide content filter options to allow lawful speech, letting users decide what lawful materials they do or don't want to engage with. But you didn't. You censored and manipulated millions of people. Do not allow people like this sitting in front of us today to be the arbiters of truth. I urge my colleagues to support my Section 230 reform, Stop the Censorship Act, which empowers users with the editorial contract. Our private businesses, you always have a contract with your customers. Allow them to pick. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Balin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say, as a former history teacher, I care a lot about the facts and the details, so let's dive in. On December 4th, then-ranking member Comer appeared on Fox News and alleged that what Elon Musk's Twitter files showed was, quote, evidence that the Biden campaign colluded with big tech to suppress a story that we now know is 100% true, unquote. That is simply not true. It is not true based on what we knew then. It is not true based on what we know now. Mr. Roth, in a declaration to the FEC in December 2020, you stated, quote, I did not receive any communications from or have had any communications with representatives of Biden for President, the Democratic National Committee, or any of their agents regarding the New York Post articles before Twitter implemented the enforcement actions on October 14th, 2020, unquote. Mr. Roth, do you stand by that statement?
Yes, absolutely.
It's also worth noting that your colleague, I believe, Lauren Culbertson, told the FEC the same thing. Ms. Gaddy, did anyone from the Biden campaign or the Democratic National Committee direct Twitter to remove or take action against the New York Post story?
No.
Mr. Baker, same question to you, please.
Not to my knowledge, no.
So, the evidence is clear. Neither the Biden campaign nor the DNC had anything to do with Twitter's decision-making about the New York Post story. My Republican colleagues are using what are otherwise innocuous emails to suggest that there was somehow collusion between Twitter and the Biden campaign. For example, in one email, and this is the same one mentioned in Mr. Donald's questioning earlier, in one email selectively used by Elon Musk, one Twitter executive sends another a series of hyperlinks on October 24th, 2020, with the comment, quote, more to review from the Biden team. For the record, this is tweet number 8 in the first installment of the so-called Twitter files. So, Ms. Gaddy, are you familiar with this email?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So, just to be clear, this email has nothing to do with the New York Post story. It is dated October 24th, 2020, after Twitter had both made and reversed its decisions about the New York Post story. Mr. Baker, do I have that right?
Based on, I think, the exhibit that was shown earlier, that sounds correct, yes.
So, Ms. Gaddy, can you clarify for the record, if you're able to, what's happening here?
Can you please be more specific about
with this email?
I don't believe I was a recipient of that email or reviewed it during my time at Twitter, so I'm sorry I don't have familiarity with that situation.
That's okay. Mr. Baker?
To the best of my understanding, these were tweets that the campaign had concerns about. I don't know the details of those, and they were referred to Twitter as, I'm not sure exactly why, but I can't get inside their heads, but they were referred to Twitter, and Twitter reviewed them, and someone, again, going off the exhibit from earlier, said they were handled. I don't know what that means in terms of whether they took any action or didn't take any action, but at least they addressed the matter. So I believe that's what I construe from that email.
Appreciate that. So from my understanding of everything that we've heard today, it's really not uncommon for outside entities including, as we've heard, Mr. Trump's campaign, to request that Twitter remove content that violates the company's terms of service. Is that correct, Ms. Gaddy?
That is very common globally.
Thank you. So, to the best of your ability to answer, Ms. Gaddy, were any decisions approved or acted upon based on the political party making the request?
No, our teams were trained to enforce our rules consistently and fairly without regard to any sort of political ideology.
Thank you. So I believe that what's happening here is my Republican colleagues know that the premise of this whole hearing is misleading. There is no evidence that the Biden campaign had anything to do with the Hunter Biden New York Post story. And the evidence we do have simply shows that the Biden campaign did what the Trump campaign and millions of Twitter users do routinely: flag content and ask Twitter to conduct its own review to determine whether it violates Twitter's own rules and policies. I yield back.
Lady Yield, Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit a June 22 study conducted by Princeton University called Powered by Twitter, the Taliban's Takeover of Afghanistan.
Without objection, so ordered.
This study covers the time frame of April to September of 2021, which is 4 to 5 month period between President Biden's official announcement of America's intentions to withdraw and the chaotic end of the American troop presence in Afghanistan. The study found that the Taliban weaponized Twitter and that Twitter's moderation policies failed. There were more than 126,000 accounts in the Taliban support network, and 83% of these Taliban-associated accounts were created before 2021, well before Twitter could claim that these accounts represented a government. These accounts shared graphic images and videos depicting dead and decomposing bodies and rampantly spread disinformation about the facts on the ground in direct violation of Twitter's public policies. Taliban tweets were shared millions of times in the summer of 2020. The study also found that 3/4 of Taliban content was produced by only 20 accounts, which is suggestively straightforward. By the way, the U.S. government classifies the Taliban as an insurgent group, in case some of my colleagues don't understand what real insurgencies are. Mr. Roth, why wasn't Twitter more effective at curtailing the clear-cut content violations by Taliban Twitter accounts?
Thank you for the question, sir. At the time that you referenced, I wasn't responsible for Twitter's work on counterterrorism.
Do you have any idea why Twitter would allow clear-cut violations by an insurgent group? And by the way, they carried out multiple suicide attacks during the time frame they were sending out these tweets, killing dozens and injuring hundreds.
It's my understanding that Twitter's policies at the time distinguished between some of the more violent portions of the Taliban and some of the more political portions of it. I'm not rendering judgment on it.
That stuff's still up on Twitter, and I just wonder how many content moderators were assigned, if any, to check on these accounts. Additionally, it appears that Twitter was profiting from Taliban's presence on the platform in the lead up to the overthrow of the Afghan government. Twitter placed ads from U.S. companies, including Amazon, Disney, McDonald's, and on the Twitter accounts of the Taliban news organization and their spokespersons and their senior leaders. Ms. Gaddy, did Twitter make money off placed ads on Taliban Twitter accounts on August 26, 2021, when 13 U.S. men and women died in a suicide bombing?
I have no knowledge of this matter.
You don't have any knowledge about whether or not these ads were up?
I do not.
According to Twitter, the decision to ban President Trump was after a close review of his tweets and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter. On June 3rd, 2018, the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini.
Now, did Twitter do that?
Sounds like the Green New Deal to me. It's your fault, Coach.
Minutes remaining, so I now yield 3 minutes to Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's try this again. According to Twitter, the decision to ban President Trump was after a close review of his tweets and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter. On June 3rd, 2018, the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini tweeted, "Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor in the West Asian region and has to be removed and eradicated. It is possible and it will happen." This tweet remains on Twitter to this day. Mr. Roth, how do you believe this tweet from the leader of Iran calling for the eradication of Israel was received and interpreted on and off Twitter?
I couldn't say for sure how that tweet was interpreted.
You would have a pretty good idea, though, of how many retweets and the amount of traffic it got.
Only from what I can see in that illustration.
Why does the Iranian leader who has explicitly pledged to eradicate the Jewish state of Israel get to remain on Twitter? Mr. Roth.
Like all of Twitter's users, the Ayatollah is subject to the same set of rules. And while I can't speak for Twitter's decisions today, I can say that Twitter took a number of enforcement actions against the Ayatollah's account, the same way that we would against.
That's still up. You understand how hypocritical this is, right? You banned a sitting U.S. president and a sitting member of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, while a man who has pledged death to America and can openly call for the death of millions of Jewish people and yet not be removed from Twitter. Do you understand how that looks? How hypocritical that is? I'm asking Mr. Baker, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth, Ms. Navarro. That's amazing. But it shows hypocrisy at Twitter. I want to pivot here, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman made a very troubling statement claiming that as Vice President Joe Biden fired the Attorney General of Ukraine, since he had knowledge of this prior to becoming a member of Congress, Mr. Goldman should provide to the committee documentation about this action. We should know who authorized Vice President Biden to take this action against the Ukrainian Attorney General. We need to know, was there an investigation to justify the firing of the Ukrainian Attorney General, and if yes, who conducted it? He needs to provide all details involving this action, including Vice President Biden's threat to withhold $1 billion of U.S. funding if the Ukrainian AG was not fired, and who authorized Vice President Biden to make that threat. I would request that the committee look into this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been an incredibly electric hearing. It'd be funny if it weren't real life. I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to be victims so very badly. But Ms. Navaroli, if I understand you correctly, public criticism and allegations of anti-conservative bias are actually making Twitter and other social media companies less willing to enforce their own policies against political conservatives, correct?
Yes, that was my understanding based on research that was done at Twitter.
Meaning the same Republicans insisting on making themselves a victim is working?
Could you repeat the question?
The same Republicans, folks on this panel who are insisting on making themselves victims in this conversation about Twitter censorship and other accusations they've made, is this working because of the conservative bias and the implications of it? Or the allegations of conservative bias? In other words, are the allegations of conservative bias making it harder for those in Twitter or those who are working there to enforce these policies against folks who incite hate speech or make...
Thank you for rephrasing that question, and thank you for asking it. Yes, these allegations are very much having an impact on the leadership within every social media company as they hope to not receive allegations of being biased or in any way being politically leaning.
Thank you. I'm not the only lawyer in the room. So you all know that while the Constitution does provide us the right to free speech, there are, of course, limitations. As Ms. Navaroli pointed out, we cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Compromising freedom of speech may seem dangerous until we weigh that compromise against the men and women massacred in Buffalo, for instance, or the many other places where radicalized violent extremists found their motivation to kill on social media. This isn't about oppression. It's about public safety. This isn't about censorship. It's about protecting our democracy from misinformation. Ms. Navaroli, it was your job to decide whether someone was yelling fire in the theater. Could you describe the coded incitement to violence policy Twitter did not implement?
Yes, thank you for that question. The coded incitement to violence policy was an incredibly nuanced policy that was created in order to fill the gaps that were existing in the already existing policies around violence. The policies around violence were explicit. So these were calls that said, I'm going to, I want to, I plan to, I wish to. Those sorts of incitements would have come down. Things like stand back, stand by. Things like I am locked and loaded and ready for a civil war were dog whistles that were not covered underneath the policy.
Thank you. Could it have saved lives if it were implemented on January 5th, 2021, or possibly in November of 2020?
I can't speculate as to what might have happened, and I do wish we would have acted.
Thank you. Ms. Gaddy, the very same words that were plastered across Twitter were shouted at the January 6th insurrection. What threats do Americans face now that Elon Musk has removed all guardrails and welcomed back Donald Trump to the platform?
Thank you for the question. I'm actually not really familiar with what the content moderation policies of Twitter are today.
Okay, thank you. Social media platforms like Twitter must own up to their responsibility in spreading violence and chaos. I'd argue so too do members of this panel and institution. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roth, I want to go back to the whole question of your finding hundreds of thousands of fake accounts set up by Vladimir Putin and the Russian Internet Research Agency, I think they called it, which was the propaganda arm in 2016, and I suppose to this day. Some have been suggesting on the other side of the aisle that it's illegitimate for the FBI or any representative of the federal government, presumably even Donald Trump, who did a lot of this, to contact private media entities in order to apprise them of anything, whether it might be the penetration of organized crime or child pornography or foreign malign influence. And I'm just wondering if you would give us a sense of how much work is actually being done, and I was going to check with you and Mr. Baker about that. How much work does Twitter and other social media entities do that relies on the FBI and other national security agencies?
Thank you for the question. There is a considerable amount of work to address foreign disinformation at Twitter and also at other companies. And this work was reliant in part on intelligence shared with companies by law enforcement and by the intelligence community. I would regard that work as essential. At Twitter, we had dozens of people working just on these questions of election interference. Those teams no longer exist under Mr. Musk.
And Mr. Baker, if you could.
Thank you, sir. Just generally, I mean, it's a matter of public record that the FBI has worked with the public, including private entities, for decades. Indeed, they've had for some number of years now an office of, I think it's called Office of Public Sector Engagement. This is part of what they do in order to fulfill their responsibilities and to do their jobs to protect the country.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. I'm going to continue down that line of questioning. So when you testified, you were just talking about working very hard to keep foreign troll farms from using Twitter and to engage in malign foreign interference. This sounds like a fairly robust undertaking. You said between 2016 and 2020, you had different teams stood up to do this. Constant vigilance?
Yes, sir. That was the phrase that we used.
Yeah. And these types of attempts are constantly evolving. They're trying to find new ways to penetrate your system, so you have to be engaging with it on and being willing to adapt on a constant basis.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And now we forward to 2020, and earlier you had testified that you were having regular interactions with National Intelligence, Homeland Security, and the FBI?
Yes, I did.
And primarily to deal with foreign interference?
Primarily, but I would
also
say almost
misinformation and all of that.
exclusively.
But you had said earlier, like your contact with Agent Chang was primarily with foreign interference?
Yes, that's right.
All right. And these were emails. Were there meetings?
Yes. Twitter met quarterly with the FBI Foreign Interference Task Force, and we had those meetings running for a number of years to share information about malign foreign interference.
Agents from Homeland Security or intelligence, or just primarily the FBI?
Our primary contacts were with the FBI, and in those quarterly meetings, they were, I believe, exclusively with FBI personnel.
And you had multiple former FBI agents on the payroll. I mean, Mr. Baker, you have 10 years experience with FBI, DOJ?
I was, well, with DOJ, it's 2 decades roughly, but I was, just for the record, I was never an FBI agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Twitter has such a close relationship with at least one FBI agent that that agent could start emails with, "Hey, Twitter folks," and could actually advise your company about violations of your own terms of service. Mr. Roth, I think it's safe to say that you had a consistent dialogue with the FBI for the weeks and months prior to the New York Post. Is that fair?
I had ongoing conversations with the FBI for years, I would say, about election security.
And in response to Mr. Fry earlier, you said you would not categorize the FBI communications as pressure.
No, I would not.
However, Twitter's director of policy wrote to you in 2020 that Twitter has seen a sustained effort by the intelligence community to push Twitter and that Twitter should keep a solid front against these efforts. He specifically cited Elvis Chan, an FBI agent in San Francisco. Now, on August 11th, 2020, Agent Chan sent you 3 documents in prep for a meeting and said the documents pertain to APT-28, a hacking unit connected with Russian military intelligence. Agent Chan arranged for having security clearance for Mr. Baker and facilitated encrypted networks for the FBI to share information with Twitter employees. And on October 14th of 2020, you stated that this feels a lot like somewhat of a subtle leak operation. Earlier today, you testified that you were following national experts on Twitter, national security experts on Twitter, as a reason to take down the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop.
Yes, sir, I did.
So, after 2016, you set up all these teams to deal with Russian interference, foreign interference. You're having regular meetings with the FBI. You have connections with all of these different government agencies, and you didn't reach out to them once?
Is that question in reference to the day of the New York Post
Yeah.
article? That's right. We generally did not reach out to the FBI to consult on content moderation decisions, especially where they related to domestic activity. It's not that we wouldn't have liked that information. We certainly would have. It's that I don't believe it would have been appropriate for us to consult with the FBI.
In December of 2020, you did a declaration to the Federal Election Commission that the intelligence community expected a leak and a hack operation involving Hunter Biden. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg confirmed that the FBI warned Meta that there was a high effort of Russian propaganda, including language specific enough to fit the Hunter laptop Biden security story. You're talking to these people for weeks and months, years prior to this leaking. They have specifically told you in October that there's going to be a leak potentially involving Hunter Biden's laptop. They legitimately and literally prophesized what happened. And you didn't contact any of them?
No, sir, I did not.
Did they reach out to you?
On and around that day, to the best of my recollection, no, they did not.
So after the story was taken down and you guys did it and you personally disagreed with it, Ms. Gaddy, you said you did. Did you contact them and say, hey, is this what you were talking about?
If that question was directed to me, no, I did
Ms.
not.
Gaddy, did you talk to anybody from the FBI?
Not to the best of my recollection.
So I guess my question is, what is the point of this program? You have constant communication. They're set up for foreign interference. They've legitimately warned you about this very specific thing, and then all of a sudden everybody just walks away? Like, this is what you planned for. This is what you prepared for. This is the information. They told you exactly what was going to happen, and then you want, I don't care if it's members of Congress, you legitimately want the American people to believe we just completely cut off contact with all of the people who we were supposed to defend against? I don't think it passes the smell test, and neither do the American people. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar for 5 minutes.
I'm honored to be a new member of Congress, where our purpose is to listen to the people and represent their voices and lift up our communities. After talking to thousands of people across Texas, asking them, What do you want me to work on for you as a new member of Congress? Not a single person told me they were concerned about a New York Post story on Twitter about Hunter Biden. Is that really what we're dedicating this committee's time to? Is that really what we're going to dedicate the next 2 years to? Our constituents of all political backgrounds are worried they're getting pushed out of their neighborhoods by spiking housing costs. They see their public schools suffering because we aren't supporting our teachers. In my state, our rural hospitals are closing. We have more uninsured people than anywhere in the country. We have the highest number of food insecure kids, and reproductive rights have been stripped away. We're talking about none of that. It seems to me that we're having these hearings so that people can beat their chest about Hunter Biden, maybe do some fundraising, get some headlines, and ironically post those on Twitter. If that's what House Republicans want to spend their time on, then that's their prerogative. But to me, it's a damn shame. We're here for a bigger purpose than that. Under the leadership of the legendary chairman, Jack Brooks from Texas, this committee implemented the Great Society through the creation of Head Start and the creation of Medicare. They investigated Watergate. They built the U.S. space program. Anything is possible if we all come together to work on what our constituents demand, if we make sure that we say to our constituents that your voice matters here. We could be ensuring that the historic investments in infrastructure and domestic manufacturing create good union jobs where we need them the most. We could take on free speech and civil liberties issues at home and across the world. We could be investigating and taking a look at these real threats of domestic terrorism and civil unrest. We could be making sure that our constituents' lives are better. But instead, we're focusing today on Twitter. The American people deserve better. I yield back my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kassar. Let's go back to this point about the